for how money is being spent.
Question number 3, Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by his statement about asset sales that it was the government's intention that, quote, every New Zealander who wants shares gets them?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that quote was attributed to me in a Stuff article, but is in fact incorrect. The quote was actually a question posed to me by Duncan Garner from TV3, to which I responded, well, that's what we are working our way through, obviously, at the moment, but the intention is that for the retail distribution, that opportunity for mums and dads to buy to be absolutely at the front of the queue. I stand by that statement.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How will he ensure that every New Zealander who wants shares gets them when half of all adults have an income less than $550 a week? How will these people be able to afford to buy shares in the newly privatised companies?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I say to the member, just because he repeats something that was a question from Duncan Garner, that does not mean it's a statement from me. Secondly, it's important to understand how New Zealanders might buy shares. Let me run the member through that because it'll be useful for him. Firstly, they could buy them through an institution like the New Zealand Super Fund, and on that basis, every New Zealander in the New Zealand Super Fund will be having shares bought on their behalf, so irrelevant of their income, that probably answers your direct question. Secondly, New Zealanders may buy them through their own funds in the form of the KiwiSaver accounts, of which there are 1.8 million, and we are growing at a substantial amount each month. Thirdly, iwi may buy them through collectively or their own resources, which may have come from a treaty settlement. Fourthly, we're seeing indications from community trusts that would want to buy them, and again, that would probably cover off some quite low-income New Zealanders. And finally, there's likely to be a retail, or will be a retail offering, which is where a New Zealander may buy them directly, either through a broker or directly, but with their own retirement savings. So there is quite a wide range of ways that a New Zealander may choose to buy shares in the mixed ownership model.
Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How will individual New Zealanders be able to buy shares when individual New Zealanders have half of all New Zealanders have an income less than $550 a week? How will those individual New Zealanders be able to afford to buy shares in companies that they currently own?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I could, if the member wanted me to, take him through the broad outline of how that process might work. But fundamentally, the way it would work would be either through a broker or a pre-allocation process and a pre-registration process where New Zealanders will be able to work out how many shares they might want, up to probably a certain amount, and that process would work. We saw that with Contact Energy, and that might see tens of thousands of New Zealanders wanting to do that. Secondly, when the member says half of all New Zealanders have an income of $550, that is recognising that there are an awful lot of New Zealanders who are, for instance, on superannuation, therefore their income is actually relatively low, but that doesn't mean it represents their asset base, which could be considerably higher. Secondly, it may mean that the person is at university or at school studying. Again, their income levels could be low, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their incomes that in the future will not be higher. And thirdly, if one goes and has a look at someone, for instance, who is basically in a KiwiSaver account, then they will be having to make investments on a weekly basis.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
To the Prime Minister, if he can't guarantee that ordinary Kiwi mums and dads will be able to afford to buy shares, how on earth can he guarantee that those same Kiwi mums and dads will be at the front of the queue?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we will see a considerable interest from Kiwi mums and dads. That's certainly been the case when there have historically been floats from Auckland airports right through the Port of Tauranga, right through to Trade Me, which was recently had the mixed ownership model effectively applied to it, where it was massively oversubscribed. There's $100 billion on deposit in New Zealand at the moment, so we know that there's a considerable amount of cash sitting out there, and in my view, The risk to this process isn't not that there's not enough people wanting to buy shares. The risk to this process is that there will be quite widespread interest, and making sure everyone gets their allocation will be the challenge.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
If it is true that mum and dad and iwi and family trusts may subscribe and may oversubscribe, then how will corporations, foreign or domestic, obtain even one share under his promise?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I wouldn't want to get in front of a process that hasn't even started yet, but if we were just to make a hypothetical example, I think, from memory, something like Contact had about 100,000 individual retail investors. I might be wrong, but it's in that order of magnitude. Again, if you sat around and said, off the top of my head, they bought up to about $5,000, that's normal for a retail offering. I'm sure the member can do the maths. You know, basically 100,000 people at $5,000, $50 million. Well, that's relatively small when you consider, let's take Mighty River Power, has a value of about $3.5 billion. The overall offering, therefore, at 49%, or about $1.5 billion.
Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
I'm listening to all the permutations, but the fact is I've asked him, if the three categories he's outlined oversubscribe, then how will any corporate get even one share? Because they, after all, the three groups are at the front of the queue.
Order. The member's question was perfectly understandable, and the Prime Minister was answering it in what I perceive to be a perfectly rational way, explaining how many shares might be sought by different sectors and therefore the overall availability given the size of these assets. And it seemed to be a perfectly rational answer to the question. The point of order, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
My question simply is, if a certain circumstance happens, then how can an overseas or domestic corporate get even one share? That's the thrust of this question.
Order. The member may have asked a question where he might wish to get a particular answer out of it, but there's no guarantee that he'll get a particular answer out of a hypothetical question. And the Prime Minister was answering the question in a perfectly rational manner. Dr. Russel Norman.
Supplementary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister accept that the vast majority of mums and dads New Zealanders will not be able to afford to buy shares in these partially privatised companies?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it depends on how you define the vast majority, because if you take, for instance, KiwiSaver accounts, of which there are 1.8 million, then that would tell you that there are an awful lot of people who actually have a KiwiSaver account. If you consider that the New Zealand Super Fund or ACC are buying on behalf of all New Zealanders, then no, I don't accept that logic. So it depends on where you're going, Mr. Speaker. But let me just raise this one point. It's important that New Zealanders understand what the member is advocating, because Russel Norman is saying he wants the New Zealand Super Fund to invest in the Australian economy and not in the New Zealand economy.
Point of order, Dr. Russel Norman.
Mr. Speaker, there was nothing in that question that was about Russel Norman. The Prime Minister simply introduced it. It had nothing to do with the answer.
Well, order. I mean, the member, in fairness, though, has kept repeating, I've listened carefully to his questions, and the theme of the questions has been pretty similar right the way through. And the Prime Minister has tried to explain the way he sees, in response to the member's questions, the way he sees access to these shares being available to New Zealanders. And in that last question there, the Prime Minister went a bit further to explain how he sees the implication in the question, the outcome of the implication in the question. And I wouldn't let him go on too long, but I think the risk when members keep asking the same question over and over again when it's being answered, the risk is a minister is going to I can't stop them going that step to say, well, the implication of this question is this. And I would have stopped them had the Prime Minister gone on too long, but I don't think it was totally unreasonable. Dr. Russel Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does he accept that what John Key is saying is that he will take the assets away from all New Zealanders who currently own them against the wishes of the majority of New Zealand who oppose the privatisation scheme? And when you take property from people against their wishes, it is called ro patu.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this may come as a huge relief to the member, but I'm not about to start talking about myself in the third person. I'll leave that for other Prime Ministers who used to have that affliction. And thank God for that, yes, exactly. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, no, I don't accept that. Majority control majority control of these companies will be held by New Zealanders. I think the vast bulk of the shares will be bought by New Zealanders, and we will be purchasing on behalf of New Zealanders an additional $22 billion approximately of assets over the next 5 years. What the member is saying is he wants New Zealand to go into deeper debt. What the member is saying is he wants to limit the opportunities for New Zealanders to invest in New Zealand. And I think on that basis the member is misguided.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is it an accurate description of his policy to say that he cut taxes on upper income earners, resulting in an increased budget deficit? He then used the deficit to justify the privatisation of public infrastructure, which will then be sold to the people who can afford to buy them, the very same people that he gave big tax cuts to?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no.
Question number 4, Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment and asks,